Well, let's get the very latest now from the UK elections, where we're joined by our UK correspondent, Holly Hudson. Holly, a very good morning to you. This election, no doubt, was billed as one of the most unpredictable election in a generation, because I guess what's at stake here is the political direction the country will go. And of course, we're talking about Brexit here. What's the latest results you're getting?
So overnight, a thumping majority, thumping victory, stonking victory, actually, Boris Johnson's described it as in the last hour, for Boris Johnson, the incumbent Prime Minister here, and his Conservative Party. The gamble that he made has paid off in spectacular fashion. Now, you may remember Boris Johnson, the Conservative Prime Minister here, called this snap election in winter, the first in December for almost a century, because he wanted to break the gridlock in Parliament and get his withdrawal agreement through, get Brexit done. And that is exactly now what is going to happen, as overnight the Conservatives have won a majority of seats. Now, the way it works here in the UK is that to form a government, a party needs more than half of the seats in the House of Commons, 326. The Conservatives currently have 358. So they've surpassed that threshold spectacularly overnight and made huge gains on the main opposition party, Labour. So with that sizable majority, Boris Johnson will be able, with that support in Parliament, to get his withdrawal agreement through before the current Brexit deadline of January 31st. So it means that, as it stands, the UK will leave the European Union. Now, all the results aren't in yet. They are still being counted, but of course the victory has been declared. Boris Johnson describing it as a stonking victory that you cannot refute. But of course this is a victory as well for Leave voters, Leave supporters over Remain. The country very much has spoken in that sense that they do want Brexit. They are very frustrated and fatigued with the fact that it's 3 years on now from the referendum. Boris Johnson's message, his very easy, very precise slogan of "Get Brexit Done," has resonated. It's eaten into that support of the main opposition party, Labour, in those heartlands in the country, the Red Wall, as I was calling it yesterday, from Wales across the north of England and the Midlands. All of those seats, some of those seats have fallen by a 10% swing, which is huge. So some seats that have been Labour since the 50s, maybe even earlier, have been won by Boris Johnson and the Conservatives in this election. And so what does that spell for the UK? There's questions now over what that means in terms of the next 5 years, because of course this isn't just about Brexit. There is of course the domestic agenda to contend with as well. And there were huge victories, huge gains for the Scottish National Party. They've pretty much taken over Scotland. Scotland voted to remain, so their leader Nicola Sturgeon saying this gives them now a mandate to call for an independence referendum. So lots of questions for the UK following this sort of shock results, because while the polls did predict a Tory majority, nothing of this size. So the only thing that is certain now is that Britain will leave the European Union next month.
Holly, so the Conservative Party will now take a commanding majority into the next 5-year Parliament. Beyond taking Britain out of the European Union, what is Boris Johnson planning to do?
Well, all along, while he has obviously repeated this phrase, this slogan, "Get Brexit Done," throughout this 5-week campaign, and as I said, that has clearly resonated with voters here. I spoke a lot about yesterday how there's been a lot of agonising and apathy among voters in relation to Brexit. That message has clearly landed for the Conservative Party. Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party, the opposition, were very much trying to frame this election on anything but Brexit. They wanted to try and keep the focus on the National Health Service, on austerity, on living standards. That hasn't landed at all. People clearly more frustrated, more focused on Brexit here in the UK and wanting to get that done. Boris Johnson has said all along that what he wants to do is get Brexit done so we can get back to focusing on those domestic issues, on the National Health Service. He's pledged 50,000 more nurses, more GPs, thousands more police officers, 20,000 more police officers, more hospitals. But of course, now we get into the nitty-gritty of the numbers, the economy, the money. Does Boris Johnson have the finances to back those pledges that he's made in his manifesto? So while the Get Brexit Done has, of course, resonated with the public, we'll now see exactly which direction Boris Johnson wants to take the country in domestically over the next 5 years.
So what does the future hold for Jeremy Corbyn, Holly? Will he stand aside for the next election?
Well, he has said that he will stand aside for the next election. Speaking earlier, he obviously described it as a disappointing night, and there is absolutely no doubt that it's a crushing defeat for Labour. Dozens of seats they've lost, their worst defeat since almost 100 years in many ways. So Jeremy Corbyn saying that this doesn't necessarily mean that social justice and the needs of the people will go away, but admitting this election was all about Brexit, and that's really where Labour fell down. Their reluctance initially to, of course, adopt a strong Brexit policy and try and straddle these two camps of Remain and Leave, saying we will renegotiate a deal and then we'll put it to a second referendum. So trying to appease both the Leave voters and the Remain supporters hasn't worked for Labour at all. Jeremy Corbyn saying that he will not lead the party in any future election, but he does want to lead the party through a period of reflection while they, of course, find a new leader. But already MPs in the Labour Party calling for Jeremy Corbyn's resignation.
Anyone putting their hands up as yet to take over as Labour leader?
Well, there are lots of hats being thrown into the ring already. Jess Phillips is one of them. There's several, of course, that could take over. Keir Starmer, the shadow Brexit secretary, as well. John Ashworth, the shadow health secretary. So we're imminently expecting to see some kind of Labour leadership contest in the next few months as a result of this, because there is absolutely, as I say, no denying that Labour have suffered a crushing defeat here. There'll be a lot of soul searching in the Labour Party as to what exactly went wrong, but there's no doubt that the Brexit strategy really didn't work for them this time round. And there's many people saying that not only this election that they will suffer, and the next election as well, they won't be able to come back from this defeat in 2024 either.
Holly, I've heard this phrase being used, tactical voting. What was that all about?
So there was a huge campaign here that people were talking about yesterday. Actually, it was described as T&T. Tactical voting and turnout were the two things that people were keeping an eye on in terms of the election that could have swung things, that could have tipped the balance. And many people, Remain supporters predominantly, were hoping that tactical voting would deprive Boris Johnson of that majority, and that is because of the way that the UK election system works. It's known as first past the post. So essentially in many constituencies, of course, there's 650 constituencies here in the UK, 650 MPs to be elected to Parliament, and what often happens is that people end up voting for, or because of the way it works, first past the post, their vote doesn't count. If there's a sort of stronghold, a safe seat for, say, a Conservative or a Labour MP, then their vote is often wasted. So Remain supporters were encouraging tactical voting on behalf of those Remain supporting parties to try and oust a safe, say, Conservative in those seats. And there was a lot of backing from celebrities as well. Hugh Grant, the actor, and several other celebrities here in the UK were encouraging that campaign, but clearly that has not landed either. That has not had the effect that was hoped for by those Remain supporters, by those people still dreaming of a second referendum. A lot of people here on the Remain side of things will be waking up very disappointed this morning.
So, Holly, when will we expect the final votes, the results rather, to be announced?
And just in the next sort of few hours, really, there'll be, of course, we've already had confirmation that this is a stonking Conservative victory, but the final results are expected to trickle in the next few hours. And then we will hear from Prime Minister Boris Johnson later on today in a speech outside Downing Street. He'll, of course, have to go back to the Queen once again, as he did earlier this year, back in July, to form a government, this time for 5 years.
Stonking, a new word we can add to South Africa's vocabulary. Thank you very much indeed, Holly. Boris Johnson will now get a chance, I guess, to slide his oven-ready deal through Parliament and get Brexit done by January 31st. We shall see. Holly Hudson, thank you very much indeed.